17 minutes. That's how long it takes for the devil to cross town in the pouring rain. You don't call a man like that because you want justice. You call him because you're out of options, out of blood and out of time. When the diner floor is cold against your cheek and your ex-boyfriend is locking the front door to finish what he started, you don't pray. You reach into your apron, you pull out a number, and you dial. The neon sign in the window had a dead E, casting a sputtering rhythmic red twitch across the checkerboard floor. Bert's din it was 2:14 a.m. Nearer tasted copper. It was a sharp, bright flavor, cutting right through the lingering scent of stale fryer grease and ammonia that permanently coated the inside of her nostrils. She lay on her side. Her right cheek was pressed flat against the cold linoleum. She didn't move right away. Moving meant taking inventory, and taking inventory meant acknowledging the damage. A heavy steel-toed boot nudged her ribs. Not hard enough to break anything this time, just hard enough to make a point. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Neera." Jimmy's voice was wet. It always sounded wet when he drank, like he was drowning in his own spit and cheap bourbon. He stood over her, his breathing, heavy chest heaving under a damp denim jacket. She blinked. The red neon pulsed. Her vision blurred, then sharpened on a single dropped French fry near her nose. It was coated in a fine layer of dust. She needed to sweep under the counter better. That was the thought her brain chose to latch onto. Not the fact that her jaw felt unhinged. Not the throbbing behind her left eye. The sweeping, "I told you," Jimmy muttered, pacing now. His boots squeaked on the wet tile. "I told you not to lock me out. 3 years, Neera. You don't just put my boxes on the lawn and change the locks." Neera slowly pulled her hands under her chest, pressing her palms against the sticky floor. Her knuckles were white. She pushed herself up onto her knees. Her hair, usually pinned up in a strict, unbothered bun, hung in damp, sweat-soaked strings across her face. Blood dripped from her nose, spotting her pale yellow uniform. 1 drop. 2. "Jimmy," she croaked. Her voice sounded foreign. Thinner. "Get out." He stopped pacing. The silence in the diner was absolute, save for the hum of the refrigerators and the rain lashing against the plate glass. He turned his face-flushed veins standing out on his neck. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, grabbing a fistful of her hair and jerking her head back. A sharp, involuntary gasp tore from her throat. "I'm going out to the truck," he whispered, leaning down so close she could smell the sour tobacco on his breath. "I'm going to get my gun, because you clearly aren't listening to me, baby. I'm going to come back in here. We're going to sit at that booth, and we're going to work this out, or neither of us is walking out." He let go. Neera collapsed forward, catching herself on her elbows. The little bell above the door jingled a sickeningly cheerful tune as he shoved his way out into the storm. The heavy glass door swung shut. The deadbolt hadn't caught. She had maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5. Neera dragged herself behind the counter. Her knee scraped against a loose nail on the baseboard, tearing her tights, but she didn't feel it. She reached up blindly, pawing at the shelf below the cash register, until her fingers closed around the heavy plastic of the landline receiver. She pulled it down. The cord knocked over a stack of paper napkins. They scattered like dead leaves. Call the cops. That was the protocol. That was what civilized people did. But Neera was tired of civilized rules. Civilized rules had gotten her a restraining order that Jimmy used as a coaster. Civilized rules meant a tired patrolman would show up 20 minutes after Jimmy blew a hole through her chest, take some notes, and shake his head. Her trembling hand went to her apron pocket. Her fingers bypassed the loose change and her order pad closing around a thick embossed piece of cardstock. She pulled it out. It was pristine, completely at odds with the blood and grime of her hands. No name, just a 10-digit number. You pour a good cup of coffee, Nira. You don't ask stupid questions. I appreciate that. That's what he had said 2 weeks ago. The man in the tailored charcoal suit who always sat in the back booth on Thursday nights. The man the local beat cops nervously ignored. The man whose quiet arrival made the entire kitchen staff stop shouting and start sweating. He had watched her politely but firmly throw out a drunk who had grabbed her waist. He had left $100 tip, which she had pushed back across the table, telling him she worked for a living, not for charity. He had smiled, a terrifying, dead-eyed smile that didn't reach his face. He had taken the money back and slid this card across the Formica table instead. For an emergency. A real one. Nira wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her wrist. She looked at the door. Jimmy's truck was out there in the dark, idling. She punched the numbers into the keypad. Her blood left red smears on the white plastic buttons. The line rang. Once. Twice. Yeah, the voice was a low rumble. It wasn't a receptionist. It wasn't a dispatcher. Nira leaned her back against the stainless steel cabinetry. She squeezed her eyes shut. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, hollow terror in its wake. "It's Nira," she breathed, her chest hitched. From Bert's. Silence on the other end. Not a dead line, but an active, heavy silence. The sound of someone instantly paying absolute attention. Nira. His voice shifted. The casual drawl vanished, replaced by something sharp and metallic. "What's wrong with your voice? Can you—" She swallowed hard. It tasted like rust. The bell above the door jingled. Jimmy was back. "Can you come get me?" "Where are you?" "Behind the counter." "Stay down. Keep breathing." The line went dead. Nira dropped the phone. It dangled by its coiled cord, swinging back and forth, thumping gently against the cabinets. She curled her knees to her chest as heavy boots walked back into the diner. Arthur was bleeding on the imported rug, but Salvatore wasn't looking at him anymore. 4 minutes ago, the mood in the private back room of the Albatross Club had been strictly business. Ugly business, but standard. Arthur had been caught skimming from the port shipments. Salvatore sat at the head of the heavy oak table, an unlit cigar resting between his fingers, listening to Arthur stammer out excuses. Then the burner phone in Salvatore's breast pocket had vibrated. Only 3 people had that number. 2 of them were currently standing in this room. The third was a waitress with sharp eyes and a tired mouth who smelled like vanilla and burned coffee. Salvatore had held up a hand. The room had instantly frozen. He answered the call. When Salvatore hung up, he didn't put the phone back in his pocket. He placed it on the table. He stood up. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked incredibly calm, which was the exact reason the 2 enforcers in the room, Vincent and Paulie, instinctively took a step back. "Put him in the trunk," Salvatore said, gesturing vaguely toward Arthur, who was still clutching his broken nose on the floor. "We're leaving." "Boss?" Vincent asked, frowning. "We ain't done with the books." "Leave the books." Salvatore walked past them, grabbing his overcoat from the rack. He didn't check to see if they were following. He knew they were. He pushed through the heavy velvet curtains, walked past the crowded, pulsing floor of the nightclub, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The black Lincoln was parked in the alley. Salvatore didn't wait for his driver. He opened the driver's side door, grabbed the wheel and started the engine. Vincent and Paulie barely had time to scramble into the back seat before the tires screamed against the wet asphalt. "Where are we going?" Paulie asked, bracing a hand against the roof as the car vaulted over a pothole. "Bert's Diner, on 4th. Vincent checked his watch. "That's across the river. Traffic on the bridge is—" Salvatore didn't answer. He just floored the accelerator. The city flashed by in streaks of yellow and red. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythmic tempo against the downpour. Salvatore stared straight ahead. His grip on the leather steering wheel was tight enough to turn his knuckles the color of old bone. "What's wrong with your voice?" He had heard the wet, rattling edge to her breath. He had heard the unmistakable hollow acoustics of someone speaking while huddled close to the floor. Salvatore wasn't a man given to sentiment. He dealt in ledgers, leverage, and violence. People were commodities. But Nera was an anomaly. She hadn't flirted with him to get a bigger tip. She hadn't cowered when his men occupied 3 tables just to drink water and glare at the other patrons. She had just poured his coffee, looked him dead in the eye, and told him he looked like he needed a decent night's sleep. She was normal. She was a fixed point of sanity in a world that ran on blood and paranoia, and someone had put their hands on her. He took the corner onto the bridge at 70 miles an hour. The rear of the Lincoln fishtailed wildly on the slick, grated metal. He corrected the spin with a brutal jerk of the wheel, never taking his foot off the gas. "We need guns," Vincent asked quietly from the back. He had recognized the shift in the air. This wasn't a business errand. This was pest control. "Keep them holstered," Salvatore said, his voice flat, empty. "Unless he runs." Salvatore didn't know who he was. A robbery gone wrong, a drunk patron. It didn't matter. The math was already done. The ledger was already balanced in his head. The clock on the dashboard read 2:28 a.m. 14 minutes since the call. Back at the diner, Nera was still breathing. That was her only job right now. She kept her eyes squeezed shut. Jimmy was standing on the other side of the counter. She could hear the heavy thud of the gun he had set on the laminate surface. "I don't want to do this." "Nera," Jimmy said. His voice echoed in the empty diner. It sounded whiny now, pathetic. The terrifying rage from earlier had settled into a sullen, dangerous self-pity. "Why do you make me act like this? You just push and push." Nera didn't answer. She tasted blood pooling under her tongue. She spat it quietly onto the linoleum. "Stand up," Jimmy said. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs felt like they were packed with wet sand. "I said stand up." Jimmy slammed his fist against the counter. The metal napkin dispensers rattled. "Don't ignore me." He walked around the edge of the counter. Nera opened her eyes. She saw the tips of his boots. He reached down, grabbing her by the collar of her uniform, and hoisted her up. Her back slammed against the pie display case. The glass shuddered. Jimmy pressed the barrel of a heavy black revolver under her chin. The metal was freezing cold. "Look at me," he breathed. Nera looked at him. Her left eye was swelling shut, but she looked at him with the one that still worked. She didn't see a monster anymore. She just saw a sad, violent man who smelled like failure. "You're not going anywhere," he whispered. Headlights swept across the front window, cutting through the rain and the neon. Bright, blinding halogen beams. A car had jumped the curb and parked directly on the sidewalk, inches from the diner's glass doors. Jimmy flinched, squinting into the glare. "We're closed," he muttered to himself, stepping back from Nera, but keeping the gun leveled at her chest. "Hey, we're closed," he yelled toward the door. The engine of the car outside shut off. The dashboard clock in the Lincoln clicked to 2:31 a.m. 17 minutes. The heavy glass door of the diner didn't just open. It swung inward with enough force to crack the hinges. The little bell at the top of the frame snapped off and hit the tile with a pathetic clink. Salvatore stepped inside. He didn't burst in with a gun drawn. He didn't shout. He walked in like a man stepping into his own living room. The rain ran off his dark wool overcoat, pooling on the floor beneath him. Behind him, The shadows detached themselves from the rain, Vincent and Paulie stepping inside and casually sliding the deadbolt locked. The sudden silence in the diner was absolute. The buzzing neon sign outside seemed to hold its breath. Jimmy lowered the gun, slightly blinking through the glare of the interior lights. He puffed out his chest, an instinctual animal reaction to the sudden drop in temperature in the room. "Hey!" Jimmy barked, raising the gun again, pointing it toward the door. "I said we're closed. Get the hell out!" Salvatore didn't look at Jimmy. His dark, deep-set eyes swept the room. They bypassed the empty booths, the overturned chairs, the spilled coffee. They found the counter. They found the smeared blood on the white cabinets. Then they found Nera. She was slumped against the pie case. Her face was a canvas of swelling purple and smeared red. Her uniform was torn, but she was looking at him. Salvatore's jaw locked. A muscle ticked just beneath his ear. It was the only outward sign that the quiet, methodical businessman had completely vacated the premises, leaving something vastly older and infinitely worse in his place. He began to walk forward, slow, measured steps. His expensive leather shoes crunched softly on a piece of broken glass. "Did you not hear me, you deaf son of a bitch?" Jimmy yelled, his voice cracking. He took a step back, the false bravado starting to chip. He leveled the gun squarely at Salvatore's chest. "I'll blow a hole right through you. Back up." Salvatore kept walking. He didn't zigzag. He didn't seek cover. He walked down the center aisle of the diner with the terrifying inevitability of a glacier. "I'm warning you." Jimmy's hand was shaking now. The heavy revolver bobbed up and down. When Salvatore was 10 feet away, Jimmy pulled the trigger. Click. The dry fire echoed loudly. Jimmy looked at the gun in confusion, his thumb desperately clawing at the hammer. He had forgotten to take the safety off in his drunken, panicked rush. He never got the chance to correct the mistake. Salvatore didn't sprint. He simply flowed forward. In one fluid, seamless motion, his left hand shot out, grasping the barrel of the revolver and twisting it violently upward. A sickening pop resonated through the room as Jimmy's wrist snapped. Jimmy screamed, a high-pitched wet sound dropping the gun. Before the weapon even hit the floor, Salvatore's right hand moved. He didn't throw a punch. He drove the heel of his palm directly into the center of Jimmy's chest. The impact sounded like a car door slamming shut. Jimmy's ribs caved under the force, the air exploding from his lungs as he was launched backward. He crashed into the counter, taking 2 heavy wooden stools down with him in a tangle of limbs and splintered wood. Jimmy gasped like a beached fish, clawing at his chest, his eyes rolling wildly. He tried to push himself up. Salvatore stepped over the debris. He looked down at the man writhing on the floor. His expression was completely blank. "Vincent," Salvatore said quietly. Vincent stepped forward from the door. He didn't have his gun out. He had a length of thick, braided leather wrapped around his fist. "Take him out back," Salvatore instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't have a mouth anymore. He doesn't have hands anymore. When you're done, put him in the truck and drive it into the quarry." Jimmy's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, to beg, but all that came out was a bloody froth. Vincent leaned down, grabbed him by the collar of his wet denim jacket, and dragged him toward the kitchen double doors. Paulie followed, picking up the discarded revolver and tucking it into his belt. The swinging doors flapped shut. A moment later, the heavy thud of the back exit, opening and closing, echoed through the diner. Then silence again. Salvatore didn't watch them leave. He had already turned around. He walked around the edge of the counter. Nera was still huddled against the display case. She hadn't moved. She was shaking so violently her teeth were chattering. The adrenaline crash was hitting her like a freight train. Salvatore stopped 2 feet away from her. The imposing, terrifying figure from a moment ago softened the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. He slowly crouched down until he was eye level with her. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to reach for someone who had just been hunted. "Nearer," he said softly. The metallic edge in his voice was gone. It was just the low, gravelly rumble she recognized from Thursday nights. She looked up. Her breath was coming in short, jagged gasps. "You came." "I told you I would." He slowly took off his heavy wool overcoat. He moved with deliberate slowness, keeping his hands visible. He draped the thick, warm fabric over her trembling shoulders. It smelled like expensive cologne and rain. "Your jaw," he murmured, his eyes scanning the bruising. "Is it broken?" I don't think so," she managed to whisper. It hurt to talk. "Just feels wrong." Salvatore finally reached out. He didn't touch her face. He carefully, gently brushed a loose strand of hair out of her good eye. His fingers were surprisingly warm. "Can you stand?" he asked. Neera nodded once. She tried to push herself up, but her knees buckled. Before she could hit the floor, Salvatore caught her. He scooped her up in his arms with effortless grace, lifting her against his chest, as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her securely, but not too tight. Neera instinctively buried her face in the crook of his neck. The smell of his cologne was a barrier against the smell of bleach and blood that permeated the diner. "Where are we going?" she mumbled against his shirt. "Away from here," Salvatore said, turning toward the broken front door. "There's a doctor waiting at my house. He's going to fix your face, and then you are going to sleep." He carried her out into the rain. The passenger door of the Lincoln was already open. The engine was running the heater, blasting warm air into the night. Neera didn't look back at the diner. She didn't think about her job or her apartment, or Jimmy. As Salvatore gently placed her in the leather seat and buckled her in, she looked at the hands that had just dismantled a man in less than 10 seconds. They were currently painstakingly adjusting the seatbelt so it wouldn't press against her bruised ribs. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she felt safe. "Salvatore," she whispered as he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. He slid in next to her, pausing with his hand on the gear shift. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Yeah. Thanks for the ride." A faint ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. He put the car in gear. "Anytime, Neera." The tires hissed against the wet asphalt as the Lincoln pulled away from the curb, leaving the flickering red neon of Bert's diner behind in the dark. The Lincoln glided to a halt. The transition from the violent downpour to the muffled, echoing acoustics of a subterranean garage was jarring. Neera kept her eyes half closed, her cheek resting against the cool leather of the passenger seat. Her body had bypassed pain and settled into a heavy, buzzing numbness. Salvatore killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the unsaid. He didn't wait for his men. He rounded the hood of the car, opened her door, and carefully scooped her up again. The scent of rain and gunpowder still clung to his overcoat. Neera didn't protest. She just let her head loll against his shoulder. They moved through a heavy steel door and into a private elevator. The brushed steel walls reflected them. Neera caught a glimpse of herself, a broken, bloody thing, wrapped in expensive wool, held by a man whose face gave absolutely nothing away. The elevator chimed softly. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, dimly lit foyer with marble floors that looked like frozen cream. Standing by a grand staircase was a man with a worn leather medical bag. He looked tired, middle-aged, and entirely unbothered by the fact that he was making a house call at 3 a.m. to a known syndicate boss. "Living room, Doc," Salvatore said, briefly striding past the man. Dr. Evans simply nodded and followed. Salvatore laid Nera down on a massive slate-grey velvet sofa. He arranged the pillows behind her head with a terrifying, meticulous gentleness, stepping back only when Dr. Evans approached. "Let's see what we have here," the doctor murmured, clicking a small pen light. "Look at her jaw," Salvatore instructed from the shadows near the fireplace. His voice was a flat baritone, devoid of panic, but laced with a quiet authority that demanded absolute competence. "And her ribs." Dr. Evans worked in silence. He prodded the swelling along Nera's cheekbone, checked her pupillary response, and gently palpated her ribcage. Nera hissed as his fingers found the spot where Jimmy's boot had landed. Salvatore shifted in the periphery. A floorboard creaked under his weight. "Nothing's broken," Dr. Evans finally said, reaching into his bag for a bottle of antiseptic. "A minor concussion, deep tissue bruising. The laceration on the lip will need 3 stitches. She's going to feel like she was hit by a truck tomorrow, but structurally, she's intact." "Do the stitches," Salvatore said. The doctor prepared a local anesthetic. "This will pinch Nera." She barely felt the needle. She was watching Salvatore. He stood by the tall arched windows looking out into the black night. He had shed his suit jacket, his white dress shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faint faded scars. He was perfectly still a predator at rest, yet his attention never left the room. When the doctor finished tying off the tiny black threads on her lower lip, he packed his bag. Salvatore handed him a thick white envelope. No words were exchanged. Dr. Evans let himself out. The front door clicked shut. The house settled into a profound, heavy silence. Salvatore walked back over to the sofa. He looked down at her. The swelling had turned her left eye into a dark, angry slit. "Do you want water?" he asked. "I want to sleep," she rasped. Her lip felt tight and completely numb. He didn't ask her to walk. He picked her up for a 3rd time, carrying her up the sweeping staircase and down a long carpeted hallway. He kicked open a heavy oak door and carried her into a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment. He set her down on the edge of the bed. It was ridiculously soft. He went into the adjoining bathroom, returning a moment later with a warm, damp washcloth. Nera flinched out of habit as he reached toward her face. Salvatore froze. His hand hung in the air between them. He didn't pull back, but he didn't advance. He just waited. "I'm not going to hurt you, Nera," he said quietly. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. She forced herself to relax, nodding once. He gently wiped the dried blood from her chin, her neck, and her hands. He moved with the slow, deliberate care of someone handling a live explosive. When she was clean, he pulled back the heavy duvet. "Sleep," he said. Nara slid under the covers, still wearing her torn yellow diner uniform. It felt wrong against the high thread count sheets, but she didn't have the energy to care. Salvatore turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness, save for the ambient light from the hallway. He didn't leave. He walked over to a heavy wingback chair in the corner of the room and sat down. "You don't have to stay," Nera whispered into the dark. "I know." He didn't move. Nera closed her eyes, the rhythmic, steady sound of his breathing anchoring her to the present. For the first time in years, the shadows in the corners of the room didn't look like monsters. Nera woke to the sensation of being buried alive in concrete. Every muscle, every tendon, every bone felt heavy and bruised. She tried to open her eyes, but her left eyelid refused to cooperate, glued shut by swelling and dried fluid. She groaned a pathetic, raspy sound that scraped against the back of her throat. Slowly, the memories of the previous night filtered through the fog of sleep and residual adrenaline. The diner. Jimmy's gun. The absolute devastating violence of the man sitting in the corner. She turned her head. The wingback chair was empty. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The bedroom was minimalist but expensive. Dark wood neutral tones, no personal photographs. It looked like a high-end hotel room devoid of a human footprint. Neera forced herself to sit up. The room spun for a long, nauseating moment before settling. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her yellow uniform was a ruined, stained mess. She looked at her hands. The knuckles were bruised, the fingernails chipped. She found a massive ensuite bathroom. On the marble vanity sat a stack of folded unfamiliar clothes, a pair of soft grey sweatpants, and a black long-sleeved t-shirt. Next to them was a new toothbrush and a bottle of ibuprofen. She stared at the pills. Salvatore didn't miss details. Neera stripped off the diner uniform, letting it fall to the floor like a shed skin. She stepped into the shower, letting the scalding water beat against her aching back until the hot water tank had to be nearing empty. When she stepped out and wiped the steam from the mirror, she finally looked at herself. It was bad. The left side of her face was a mottled canvas of purple blue and sickly yellow. Her lower lip was swollen and punctuated by the neat black row of stitches. She looked like a casualty of war. She dressed in the provided clothes. They smelled like fresh laundry detergent and faintly of cedar. They were too big, pooling around her waist and wrists, but they were soft. She swallowed 3 ibuprofen dry and opened the bedroom door. The house was eerily quiet. She padded down the carpeted hallway barefoot. She found the staircase and descended into the grand foyer. It felt less intimidating in the daylight, but only slightly. She followed the hum of a refrigerator, navigating through a formal dining room that looked like it had never been used, and pushed through a swinging door into the kitchen. It was an industrial-grade marvel. Stainless steel appliances, double ovens, and a massive granite island. Sitting at the island, nursing a mug of coffee and reading a newspaper, was a man built like a brick wall. He had a thick, scarred neck and a nose that had clearly been broken multiple times. He looked up as the door swung shut behind her. He didn't look surprised. "Morning," he grunted, folding the newspaper. "I'm Leo. Boss said you'd probably be hungry when you woke up." "I'm Neera," she said, her voice still rough. "I know." Leo stood up. He looked entirely out of place in the pristine kitchen. "You want eggs toast? I don't really cook, but I can manage toast without burning the house down." "Coffee is fine," Neera said, wrapping her arms around her ribs. Leo pointed to a sleek, terrifyingly complex espresso machine on the counter. "Help yourself. I only know how to use the drip pot." Neera walked over to the machine. It was familiar territory. Her hands moved on autopilot, grinding beans, tamping the grounds, pulling a shot. The rhythmic mechanical process was soothing. It grounded her. As the dark liquid dripped into a porcelain mug, she turned to look at Leo. He was watching her cautiously, like she was a stray dog that might bite. "Where is he?" she asked. "The boss." Leo shifted his weight. "Downstairs, in his office, dealing with some administrative work." Neera didn't need to ask what kind of administrative work. She remembered the cold, detached way Salvatore had ordered Jimmy taken to the quarry. A chill traced its way down her spine. Jimmy was dead. She knew it with absolute certainty. She waited for the guilt, the horror, the moral revulsion to hit her. It didn't come. All she felt was a profound, hollow relief. The monster that had haunted her for 3 years was gone, erased by a bigger, quieter monster. She poured a splash of milk into her coffee, leaning against the counter. "Is he coming up?" "Eventually," Leo said. "He told me to make sure you didn't leave." Nira paused the mug halfway to her mouth. She looked at Leo, her good eye narrowing. I'm a guest, Leo. Or a prisoner. Leo held up his hands defensively. Guest. Definitely a guest. He just said you shouldn't wander outside. It's not safe for you out there right now. Before Nira could press the issue, the heavy oak door on the far side of the kitchen opened. Salvatore walked in. He was wearing a fresh suit, dark navy this time, without a tie. He looked immaculate, well-rested, and completely unfazed. The only sign that he had been awake for over 30 hours was the faint, dark shadowing beneath his eyes. He stopped just inside the doorway, his gaze locking onto Nira. He took in the oversized clothes, the damp hair, the fresh bruising blooming across her face. Leo, Salvatore said, not breaking eye contact with Nira. Take a walk. Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed his newspaper and practically bolted through the swinging doors, leaving them alone. The silence stretched. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the night before. It was an assessing silence. Two feral animals circling each other in an open cage. You're awake, Salvatore finally said, walking slowly toward the island. I am, Nira replied. She took a sip of her coffee. It burned her lip, but she welcomed the sting. How's the administrative work? A flicker of surprise crossed Salvatore's face, so brief she thought she might have imagined it. He stopped a few feet away from her, leaning his hip against the granite counter. Handled, he said simply. Nira set her mug down. She needed both hands to grip the edge of the counter to stop them from shaking. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of the reality she was stepping into. Jimmy, she asked. The name felt like ash in her mouth. Jimmy is no longer a concern, Salvatore said. His tone was perfectly flat. He wasn't boasting. He was reporting the weather. He won't bother you again. He won't bother anyone again. Nira closed her eyes. She let out a long, shuddering breath. Okay. Just okay. Salvatore watched her closely. She opened her eyes and looked right at him. I'm supposed to cry for him. He put a gun to my head, Salvatore. He broke my jaw once. He cracked 3 of my ribs on my birthday last year. I'm not going to mourn a rabid dog just because I used to feed it. Salvatore's jaw tightened. He reached out his fingers, tracing the rim of an empty coffee cup on the counter. Most people would be terrified right now. I am terrified, Nira said honestly. But not of you. You should be. Maybe. Nira crossed her arms over her chest, immediately wincing as the movement pulled her bruised ribs. But you didn't break down my door to hurt me. You broke it down to stop him. So what happens now? Salvatore studied her. She wasn't shrinking. Even battered, bruised, and wearing his borrowed clothes, she had a spine made of iron. It was the same grit he had seen when she threw a drunk out of her diner without blinking. Now, Salvatore said, his voice dropping an octave. You stay here. You heal. You eat whatever Leo manages to cook without burning, and you sleep. I have a job, Nira said, the absurdity of the statement hitting her as soon as the words left her mouth. I have rent. You don't have a job, Salvatore corrected gently. Bert's diner suffered some severe structural damage last night, mostly to the front window and the counter. It's closed for renovations. Nira stared at him. You bought my diner. I invested in local real estate, he countered smoothly. And your rent has been paid through the end of the year. Your landlord was very accommodating. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Nira's chest. She pushed off the counter. Don't do that. Salvatore frowned. Do what? Don't manage me, she snapped, stepping closer to him. She had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. I didn't call you to become a charity case. I called you because I was going to die on that linoleum. I'm grateful. God, I owe you my life. But I'm not one of your assets. I don't belong on a ledger." Salvatore didn't back away. He looked down at her, the dark, dangerous intensity returning to his eyes. He slowly reached out. Nera stiffened, but held her ground. He didn't touch her face this time. His large, warm hand wrapped gently around the back of her neck, his thumb resting against the pulse point at her throat. He could feel her heart hammering like a trapped bird. "You aren't a ledger entry, Nera," he said quietly, the gravel in his voice scraping against her skin. "I don't keep things I don't value, and I don't invest in things that break easily. You called me because you wanted to live. You're alive. But you are going to stay here until I am completely satisfied that no one connected to Jimmy is going to come looking for you. And then," she challenged, her voice a rough whisper. She didn't pull away from his grip. "And then," Salvatore said, his thumb brushing a stray damp curl away from her collarbone, "we figure out what you want to do next." He dropped his hand, stepping back and instantly severing the electric tension between them. He turned toward the door. "There's a television in the living room," he said over his shoulder. "Books in the study. Don't go outside the gates. I have a meeting in the city. I'll be back by dinner." "Salvatore," she called out before he pushed through the swinging door. He paused, looking back. "If Leo tries to cook dinner," Nera said, a dry, cynical half-smile touching her bruised lips, "I'm ordering pizza." The ghost of a smile returned to Salvatore's face. It completely changed the landscape of his features, making him look devastatingly human for a split second. "Get extra cheese," he said. And then he was gone. By day 4, the swelling had receded enough that Nara could fully open her left eye. The violent purple and black mapping her cheekbone had faded into a sickly mottled yellow. The stitches in her lip itched terribly. The house on the hill operated on a strange insulated rhythm. It was a fortress disguised as a luxury estate. Men in tailored suits, men who carried themselves with the heavy, deliberate caution of loaded weapons, came and went at all hours. They held hushed meetings in the study downstairs. They never came up to the second floor. They never looked Nera in the eye if she happened to cross their path in the foyer. To them, she was a ghost. To Salvatore, she was something else, entirely. He was rarely there during the day. His business, whatever the bloody mechanics of it were, required his presence in the city. But every evening exactly at 7, the heavy front door would open. He would shed his overcoat, hand his keys to a silent driver, and find her. Usually he found her in the kitchen with Leo. Leo had become an unexpected anchor. The hulking enforcer was terrifying to look at, but he possessed the culinary skills of an unsupervised toddler. On the second night, Nera had caught him trying to microwave a frozen steak. She had intervened, physically, pushing his massive frame away from the counter and taken over. Cooking became her physical therapy. Slicing vegetables tending to a simmering sauce, the methodical heat of the stove, it was all normal. It was a tactile reminder that her hand still worked, that she could still create something nourishing. On Thursday evening, Salvatore walked into the kitchen just as Nera was pulling a pan of roasted chicken and root vegetables from the oven. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the cavernous room, completely masking the faint, permanent scent of floor wax and cold marble. Leo was sitting at the island, meticulously grating Parmesan cheese with a look of intense, furrowed concentration. Salvatore stopped in the doorway. He loosened his tie, his dark eyes sweeping over the scene. He looked exhausted. The sharp, predatory edge he carried outside these walls was blunted, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. "Boss." Leo acknowledged, not looking up from the cheese grater. "She wouldn't let me use the stove again." "Good," Salvatore murmured. He walked over to the island, sliding onto a stool across from Leo. He looked at Nera. "How's the jaw?" "Better," she said. She set the heavy pan down on a trivet. "I can chew solid food today, assuming it's cooked to death." Salvatore's gaze lingered on her face. He catalogued the fading bruises, the neat line of black thread on her lip. He didn't offer pity. Pity was useless. He just nodded, accepting the data. "Set a plate for him, Leo," Nera said, turning to wash her hands. "I have paperwork," Salvatore said automatically, though he didn't move to get up. "Paperwork doesn't bleed out if you leave it for 20 minutes, Nera replied, drying her hands on a towel. She turned and leveled a look at him. "Eat the chicken, Salvatore. You look like a corpse." Leo froze. The grating stopped. The silence in the kitchen became absolute. Men had disappeared into the harbor for speaking to Salvatore, with half that much disrespect. Salvatore stared at her. For a long, tense second, neither of them blinked. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. He let out a low, rough exhale that might have been a laugh. "Put extra potatoes on my plate," he told Leo. Dinner was eaten in the informal breakfast nook off the kitchen. It was the first time the three of them had sat down together. Leo ate with the speed and efficiency of a stray dog finishing his plate in under 4 minutes before excusing himself to check the perimeter. That left Nera and Salvatore alone. The rain had returned a steady grey drizzle, smearing the massive windows. Salvatore ate slowly. He didn't eat like a man enjoying his food, he ate like a man fueling a machine. "The diner is being gutted," he said, abruptly, cutting through the silence. "The contractors found black mold behind the fryer. It's going to take another 3 weeks to rebuild." Nera set her fork down. The mention of her old life always brought a cold draft into the room. "You didn't have to pay for the mold remediation." "I own the building now, Nera. It's my mold." He took a sip of his water. "Besides, I want it done right. When you go back, I don't want you breathing that garbage in. When you go back." The words hung in the air, a clear boundary, a reminder that this, the house, the protection, the dinners was a temporary suspension of reality. She was a civilian. He was a cartel boss. Their orbits had collided violently, but eventually gravity would pull them back to their respective worlds. "Did you find Jimmy's truck?" she asked quietly. Salvatore stopped chewing. He swallowed, setting his silverware down carefully on the ceramic plate. The atmosphere in the nook instantly dropped 10 degrees. "I don't think you want to ask me questions about that night, Nera." "I do," she insisted. She leaned forward, wincing slightly, as a bruised rib protested. "I sit in this house all day. I watch your men patrol the gates. I know exactly what you are, Salvatore. I knew what you were before I dialed your number. I'm not a child. I want to know if there's a loose end." He looked at her truly, looked at her. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by that familiar, terrifying intelligence. He was assessing her limits. Jimmy had a gambling debt. Salvatore said, his voice stripped of all emotion. To a crew operating out of the South Side, nasty people, not my people. He borrowed 10 grand, missed 3 payments. They were looking for him. Nera felt the blood drain from her face. Jimmy had always been reckless, but 10 grand to loan sharks. The night he came to the diner, Salvatore continued methodically. He wasn't just coming to assert dominance over you. He was coming to empty your cash register. And if you didn't have enough, he was going to offer you to them to cover the interest. Nera's stomach violently contracted. The copper taste of adrenaline flooded the back of her throat. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "He's gone," Salvatore said softly. He reached across the table. He didn't grab her hand. He just placed his hand palm up an inch away from hers. An offer. The truck was crushed and sold for scrap in a yard I control. The Southside crew received an anonymous tip that Jimmy skipped town to Mexico. They wrote off the debt. There are no loose ends. No one is coming for you. Neera looked at his large, calloused hand, the hand that had shattered a man's chest without hesitation. Slowly her trembling fingers reached out. She pressed her palm against his. His skin was warm. His fingers curled slightly, just enough to anchor her, but loose enough that she could pull away. She didn't pull away. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," he said. His gaze dropped to their joined hands. "I didn't do it because I'm a good man, Neera. I did it because he touched what wasn't his." He stood up, breaking the contact. He picked up his empty plate. "Get some sleep," he said, turning toward the kitchen. "Dr. Evans is coming tomorrow to take the stitches out." Neera sat alone in the breakfast nook for a long time, listening to the rain, the phantom warmth of his hand still burning against her skin. The peace lasted exactly 12 days. Neera's stitches were gone, leaving a faint, pink line on her lower lip. Her jaw no longer ached when it rained. She had settled into a quiet, bizarre domesticity, with Leo learning the schedules of the guards, mapping out the massive library on the ground floor. She was reading in the study when the echo of Jimmy's life finally reached the house. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Salvatore wasn't expected back for hours. Neera was curled up in one of the oversized leather armchairs, a heavy history book resting on her knees. The heavy mahogany doors of the study swung open abruptly. Salvatore strode in. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was missing his collar open, and there was a dark, wet smear of something across his right cuff. Blood. Behind him, Leo and another enforcer dragged a man into the room. The man was struggling, kicking wildly, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack suit that was rumpled and stained. He didn't look like a mobster. He looked like a bureaucrat who had missed 3 nights of sleep. "Put him in the chair," Salvatore ordered. Leo slammed the man into a wooden chair opposite the heavy oak desk. The man gasped, clutching his ribs. Neera froze in her armchair. She was tucked in the alcove near the window, partially obscured by a heavy bookshelf. Salvatore hadn't seen her. His absolute focus was on the man in the chair. "You have 10 seconds to explain to me why you've been asking questions about Bert's diner," Salvatore said. He walked behind his desk, not sitting, just leaning his hands flat against the polished wood. The man swallowed hard. He reached into his jacket pocket. Instantly, Leo had a gun drawn and pressed against the man's temple. "Badge," the man stammered, raising his hand slowly. "Just my badge. Detective Miller, 6th Precinct." Salvatore didn't blink. "I know who you are, Miller. I own your captain. I want to know why you are sniffing around a closed diner." Miller's eyes darted nervously around the room. Jimmy was my CI informant. He was feeding me names on the Southside crew. He went dark 2 weeks ago. His landlord said his ex-girlfriend worked at Bert's. I just went to ask if she knew where he was. "Jimmy is dead," Salvatore said flatly. Miller flinched. "Dead how?" He choked on his own stupidity, Salvatore replied. He walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from the seated detective. "Now here is the problem, Miller. You went to that diner. You started asking the construction crew about the waitress. You started running her name through the system." Neera's breath hitched. Salvatore heard it. His head snapped toward the alcove, the lethal cold fury in his eyes instantly fractured when he saw her sitting there, the heavy book clutched to her chest. "Leo!" Salvatore barked. "Get her out of here!" Leo stepped back from the detective, turning toward Neera. "Come on, Miss Neera, let's go to the kitchen." "No." Neera stood up. Her legs were trembling slightly, but she locked her knees. She didn't drop the book. She walked out of the alcove, stepping into the center of the room. Salvatore's jaw tightened. "Nearer. Leave the room. Now." "He was running my name," she said, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart. She looked down at Detective Miller. The cop looked confused, his gaze bouncing between the bruised waitress and the syndicate boss. Why, Jimmy was the criminal, not me. Standard procedure. Miller stammered, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, but not quite understanding it. "Just looking for leverage. Sometimes the girlfriend knows where the stash is." Neera felt a sickening wave of revulsion. Even in death, Jimmy was dragging her through the mud. The system that was supposed to protect her just saw her as an accessory, a pressure point. She looked at Salvatore. "What happens to him?" Salvatore's eyes were completely unreadable. The mask was back in place. He was furious she had disobeyed him, but he wasn't going to drag her out, kicking and screaming in front of his men. "He goes back to his precinct," Salvatore said softly, never breaking eye contact with Neera. "He deletes the search history on your name. He writes up a report stating Jimmy's body was found in the river victim of a cartel hit. Case closed. And he never speaks your name again." Salvatore slowly shifted his gaze back to the trembling detective. The temperature in the room plummeted. "Because if you do, Miller," Salvatore whispered, leaning down so only the cop could hear the full, terrible weight of the threat, "I will not shoot you. I will cut off your fingers, one by one, and I will mail them to your daughter in Connecticut. Do you understand me?" Miller was weeping openly now, nodding frantically. "Yes. Yes, I swear to God. I never saw her. I never went to the diner." "Get him out of my house," Salvatore told Leo. Leo hauled the detective to his feet and dragged him out the doors. The heavy wood clicked shut. The silence that rushed in to fill the vacuum was deafening. Salvatore didn't move. He stood with his back to Neera, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The tension rolling off his shoulders was thick enough to choke on. "You shouldn't have seen that," he finally said. His voice was raw. Neera slowly placed her book on the desk. "You think I'm fragile?" Salvatore turned around. His eyes blazed with a sudden dark intensity. "You are fragile, Neera. A man broke your ribs because you locked a door. The world you live in is soft. My world is entirely composed of teeth and glass. I just threatened to mutilate a man and traumatize a child. That is what I am." He took a step toward her, his chest heaving slightly. He wanted her to be repulsed. He was begging her to be terrified, because it was easier if she ran away. "I know what you are," Neera said quietly. She didn't step back. She closed the distance between them. She reached up, placing her hands flat against his chest. She could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart through the fine cotton of his shirt. "You threatened him because he was coming for me," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You didn't do it for business. You did it to build a wall around me." Salvatore's hands hovered over her hips, paralyzed by restraint. "I ruin everything I touch, Neera. I corrupt it." "Jimmy corrupted me," she whispered fiercely. "He made me small. He made me scared of my own shadow. You—" She swallowed hard, staring at the faded scar on his jawline. "You make me feel like I can breathe." A ragged sound tore from Salvatore's throat. His restraint shattered. His large hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling sharply, as if the vanilla scent of her skin was the only oxygen left in the room. He held her with a desperate, terrifying strength, completely at odds with his usual measured control. Neera wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, anchoring him. She felt the slight tremor in his frame. The monster in the dark was just a man terrified of breaking the only clean thing he had ever held. They stood there in the silent study, the blood on his cuff pressed against her shirt, recognizing the exact moment the line between protector and captor vanished entirely. 3 weeks later, the air outside had turned crisp. Autumn had finally driven the relentless rain away. Neera was standing in the master bedroom, packing a small duffel bag. She folded the grey sweatpants, the ones she had worn on her first day here, and tucked them into the corner. She paused, running her fingers over the soft fabric. Her face was completely healed. The swelling was gone, the bruises faded to a memory. Only the tiny pale scar on her lip remained. The door opened behind her. Neera didn't turn around. She recognized the heavy, measured footsteps. Salvatore walked into the room. He was holding a thick manila envelope. He stopped at the foot of the bed, watching her pack. He looked immaculate in a black suit, but his eyes were hollow. "The contractors finished this morning," Salvatore said. His voice was strictly business, flat professional, utterly detached. "I know," Neera said. She zipped the duffel bag. "Leo told me." Salvatore tossed the envelope onto the bed. It landed with a heavy final slap against the duvet. "The deed to the building," he said. "Fully paid off. The business license is transferred to your name. There's 50,000 in a business account to cover payroll and inventory for the first 6 months. The keys are inside." Neera stared at the envelope. She didn't reach for it. "Why?" she asked quietly. "It's a clean break," Salvatore said, looking past her out the window. He couldn't look at her face. "No strings, no debts. You go back to your life. You run your diner. You lock the door at night, and you don't ever have to look over your shoulder again." It was everything she had wanted before Jimmy broke her jaw. Independence, security, a safe, quiet life. Salvatore was giving her the world on a silver platter, meticulously scrubbed clean of his fingerprints. "And you?" she asked, turning to face him. Salvatore's jaw tightened. "I go back to work." Neera slowly walked around the bed. She picked up the envelope. It was heavy, the weight of freedom. She looked at Salvatore. He stood like a statue, bracing himself for the impact of her leaving. He was letting her go because he loved her enough to know his world would eventually consume her. He was a creature of the dark, refusing to drag her down into the pitch black with him. Neera opened the envelope. She pulled out the deed, the bank statements, the pristine silver keys. Then she calmly tore the deed cleanly in half. The sound of tearing paper was deafening in the quiet room. Salvatore's head snapped back to her, his eyes widening in sheer shock. "What are you doing?" Neera put the torn pieces of paper on the nightstand. She dropped the keys next to them. "I don't want a clean break," she said. "Neera." Salvatore's voice held a warning note. A desperate plea for her to be rational. "Listen to me. I am a target. Every day I walk out the door, I have a target on my back. If you stay with me, they won't look at you as a civilian anymore. They will look at you as my only vulnerability. I cannot guarantee you won't get hurt again. I was a civilian when Jimmy almost beat me to death on a linoleum floor." Neera shot back, her voice rising. "Safety is an illusion, Salvatore. It doesn't exist. There are only the people who hurt you, and the people who stand between you and the fist." She stepped closer to him. He instinctively backed away, hitting the edge of the heavy oak dresser. He was trapped. "You think you're protecting me by sending me away," she said, stopping inches from him. She reached up, resting her palm flat against his chest. "But you're just protecting yourself. You're terrified that one day I'm going to look at you and see a monster." Salvatore's breathing was shallow. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tortured. "I am a monster, Nera." "You're my monster," she said fiercely, her fingers curling into his lapel. "You came when I called. You stayed in the chair all night. You gave me my breath back." "Nera, I'm not leaving." She tilted her chin up, her gaze unyielding. "I'm keeping the diner. I'm going to run it during the day. I'm going to serve burnt coffee to your enforcers. And at night, I am coming back to this house. With you. Because this is where I am safe." The absolute certainty in her voice broke the last remaining pillar of his resistance. Salvatore let out a ragged, defeated groan. He grabbed her face with both hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, mapping the territory he had violently claimed and fiercely protected. He crashed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate bruising and tasted like an absolute surrender. Nera gasped against his lips, her hands immediately tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. There was no hesitation, no holding back. It was the collision of two people who had survived the worst the world had to offer and found a solitary, brutal sanctuary in each other. He backed her up against the bed, his mouth never leaving hers, his hands tracing the curve of her spine, as if checking to ensure she was solid, real, and entirely his. When he finally pulled back to breathe, resting his forehead against hers, his hands were shaking. "You're going to regret this," he whispered, his eyes closed. Nera smiled. It was a cynical, knowing smile that pulled slightly at the scar on her lip. "Probably," she murmured, resting her hands over his racing heart. "But we'll order extra cheese for dinner." Salvatore let out a soft, genuine laugh that vibrated against her chest. He pulled her flush against him, burying his face in her hair. The storm outside had finally passed. Inside the fortress on the hill, the devil held the waitress in his arms, entirely at the mercy of the only thing in the world that could break him. 17 minutes changed Nera's life forever. Sometimes the knight in shining armor is a myth, and the only one who can pull you out of the dark is a monster who knows the terrain. Salvatore and Nera's story is a testament to survival, brutal loyalty, and finding a twisted kind of peace in the shadows. If you felt the tension and loved this gritty, slow-burn romance, drop a comment below on your favorite scene. Hit that like button, share this story with your fellow dark romance readers, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, thrilling audio dramas.